It is an ordinary morning in Gaza. A girl, maybe 8 years old, chases a cat through a narrow alley. Her laughter bounces off crumbling concrete walls painted over with Arabic script. A man on a plastic chair sips tea outside a bakery that has been his family's for 3 generations. School children in white uniforms jostle past each other on their way to class, backpacks too big for their small bodies. Someone's radio plays an old Arabic song, something slow and familiar, something that sounds like memory itself. The city hums. It breathes. It is tired, but it is alive. And then, something changes. It's almost imperceptible at first. The way a dog stops barking. The way a mother pauses mid-sentence and lifts her eyes to the sky. The way the cat stops, turns its head, and disappears under a doorway. The radio still plays, but someone has lowered the volume. Conversations drop to murmurs. The air itself seems to tighten. High above, invisible to the naked eye but not to the ears of those who have learned to fear it. A sound. Not loud. Not dramatic. A low, mechanical hum, like a ceiling fan somewhere far above the clouds. The sound of something watching. The drone. The man with the tea doesn't put his cup down. He just stares upward. He doesn't run. He's learned that running sometimes makes no difference. He just stares, like he's trying to read the sky the way sailors once read the stars, searching for a sign, a warning, some fragment of meaning before the world changes. And then the call to prayer stops. Not gently, not because the adhan has ended. It stops mid-syllable. The radio cuts out. Even the wind seems to hold its breath. In the alley, the girl in white stops running. She looks up. And her face, God, her face, carries an expression no child should ever know. Not fear, exactly. Familiarity. The look of someone who has felt this moment before. A second of silence. Then. But this didn't start here. It never starts where you think it starts. To understand what just happened in that alley, to understand why a child knows that particular look, you have to go back. Not decades. Not a century. You have to go back to the very architecture of a world being rebuilt from the wreckage of empires. The late 19th century is a world convulsing with new ideas. Nationalism is sweeping Europe like a fever. People who had lived side by side for generations are suddenly asking dangerous questions. Who are we? Where do we belong? Who was here first? And perhaps most dangerously of all, who has the right to decide? For Jewish communities scattered across Europe, these questions carry a particular urgency. Because for centuries, in Russia, in Poland, in Germany, in France, the answer to who belongs had never included them. Pogroms, expulsions, forced conversions, the slow, grinding violence of a continent that tolerated Jewish life but never fully welcomed it. It is in this context that a Viennese journalist named Theodor Herzl attends the trial of Alfred Dreyfus in Paris in 1894. A French Jewish officer falsely accused of treason, and watches as crowds chant, "Death to the Jews," in the streets of what was supposed to be the most enlightened city in the world. Something breaks in Herzl that day. Or perhaps something clarifies. He becomes convinced of a truth that will reshape the map of the Middle East, that Jewish people will never be truly safe in a country they do not govern themselves. They need a homeland. A state. He calls this vision Zionism. But here is where the story begins to crack and complicate itself, the way all stories do when they move from idea to geography. Because the land Herzl and the early Zionists had in mind, ancient, biblical, storied Palestine, was not empty. And what happened next would reshape everything. There is a phrase that was used in early Zionist literature that has haunted historians ever since. A land without a people for a people without a land. It was a rhetorical flourish, an ideological slogan. And it was wrong. At the turn of the 20th century, roughly 500,000 people lived in Ottoman Palestine. The vast majority were Arab Muslims, with significant Arab Christian communities and a small but ancient Jewish population that had never left, communities that called themselves simply the people of this land. They farmed. They traded. They built. They buried their dead in soil that had held the bones of their ancestors for generations. These were not abstractions. These were families with names and histories and memories of their own. Farmers who knew which fig tree gave fruit in September and which well ran dry by August. Merchants who traded in the same markets where their grandfathers had traded. Families who had watched empires come and go, Byzantine, Arab, Crusader, Mamluk, Ottoman, and had remained. And so, beginning in the 1880s and accelerating through the first decades of the 1900s, Jewish immigrants from Europe began arriving in Palestine in waves, what they would call aliyot, the ascents. Each wave brought new communities, new ideas, new ambitions. They established agricultural settlements, drained swamps, built cities. They revived the Hebrew language, ancient, liturgical Hebrew, and turned it into something living. They brought with them a burning conviction that they were not colonizers, but returners. That this land was not foreign, but ancestral. Two peoples. One land. Two stories of belonging, both real, both ancient, both urgent. And presiding over all of it, trying to manage what it did not fully understand and had not fully planned, the Ottoman Empire. Weakened, overstretched, fractured by internal conflict and external pressure. The empire that had held this land for 4 centuries was dying. And into its dying, the great powers of the world began to reach. But the story goes back further. And it involves a promise, or rather, 2 promises that could not both be kept. It is November 2nd, 1917. The world is at war. Trenches stretch across France like wounds that will not heal. Empires are collapsing. And in a single typed letter, 67 words long, the British government makes a commitment that will echo for more than a century. The Balfour Declaration. Named for Arthur James Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, it states, in careful, diplomatic language, that His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Read it again. Carefully. The British government is promising to support a Jewish national home, while simultaneously promising to protect the rights of the Arab majority who already live there. A promise made to 2 peoples. In one letter. Written by men who had never set foot in Palestine. What the British did not fully reckon with, or perhaps chose not to, was that they had also made a separate promise to the Arab leaders who had helped Britain fight against the Ottoman Empire. The Hussein McMahon correspondence, a series of letters from 1915 and 1916, had suggested, ambiguously, diplomatically, but suggested nonetheless, that Arab independence would follow an Arab revolt against the Ottomans. The Arabs revolted. Britain won the war. And then came Balfour. In 1920, the League of Nations granted Britain the mandate for Palestine, official authority over the land. Britain was now responsible for governing a territory where 2 nationalisms were on a slow collision course, while simultaneously beholden to promises it had made to both sides. This is the original wound. Not the wound of ancient hatred, not the wound of religious war, though religion would be layered in, as it always is. The original wound is bureaucratic, imperial. The wound of men in London drawing lines on maps they couldn't read, making promises they couldn't keep, setting the terms of a tragedy they would never have to live through themselves. And then everything changed. Again. The 1920s and 1930s in Mandatory Palestine are a slow unraveling. Jewish immigration accelerates, particularly as conditions for Jews in Europe deteriorate with alarming speed. Arab resistance grows, sometimes through political channels, increasingly through violence. The British, trapped between their competing obligations, manage both badly. In 1929, riots erupt across Palestine. In Hebron, a city where Jewish and Arab communities had lived in proximity for centuries, 67 Jewish residents are massacred by Arab rioters. It is not the first violence, and it will not be the last. But it marks something. The moment when coexistence stops feeling like an option and starts feeling like a memory. The British respond with the Peel Commission in 1937, which for the first time proposes partition, dividing the land into separate Jewish and Arab states. Jewish leaders are divided. Most Arab leaders reject it outright. The proposal goes nowhere. But the idea, partition, will not go away. And then comes the horror that redraws everything. The Holocaust. 6 million Jewish lives extinguished in the industrial machinery of European anti-Semitism. The world watches, or refuses to watch, and afterward is left confronting the catastrophic failure of every promise of safety, every assurance of belonging that European civilization had ever made to its Jewish citizens. Survivors emerge from the camps, from hiding places, from forests and attics, and for hundreds of thousands of them, there is nowhere to return to. Their communities are gone. Their homes have been taken. Europe has made its answer to the question of belonging unmistakably clear. For many, Palestine is the only answer left. For the Zionist movement, the Holocaust is not just a tragedy. It is the final proof of Herzl's original argument. The need for a Jewish state is not theoretical. It is urgent. It is existential. And for the Arab population of Palestine, this argument, this urgency, this wave of desperate migration, is not something they feel responsible for. They did not build the death camps. They did not run the pogroms. Why, they ask, must they bear the cost of Europe's crimes? This is not a comfortable question. But it is a real one, and it has never been satisfactorily answered. But this didn't start here, and here is where the world finally had to decide. By 1947, Britain is exhausted. Economically devastated by the war, stretched thin across a global empire that is beginning to fracture, facing a Palestinian crisis it cannot solve. Jewish paramilitary groups, the Haganah, the Irgun, the Lehi, are conducting an escalating campaign against British rule. Arab resistance is mounting. Britain cannot satisfy anyone. It hands the problem to the newly formed United Nations. The UN Special Committee on Palestine spends months in the region, hearing testimony, examining evidence, traveling the land. And in November 1947, the UN General Assembly votes on Resolution 181, a plan to partition Palestine into 2 states, one Jewish, one Arab. Jerusalem, holy to 3 religions, would be under international administration. The Jewish Agency accepts the plan, reluctantly. It is not everything they had hoped for, but it is a state. A legal, internationally recognized state. For a people who have survived the Holocaust, legitimacy matters enormously. The Arab Higher Committee and the surrounding Arab states reject the plan outright. The Arab population of Palestine was the majority. They argued, reasonably, that they were being asked to give up more than half of a land that was predominantly theirs to accommodate people who had arrived mostly within the last generation. The UN, they argued, had no right to make this decision on their behalf. The vote passes, 33 in favor, 13 against, 10 abstentions. In the streets of Tel Aviv, Jewish residents dance. In Palestinian cities, the reaction is grief and fury. And in both communities, among the farmers and the families and the children who have nothing to do with diplomacy, there is a creeping dread. Because everyone understands what the vote means. Not peace. Not resolution. The starting gun of a war that had been building for 30 years. What happened next would become 2 different stories. Depending on who you ask, you will hear either a miracle or a catastrophe. And you would be right either way. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion stands in the Tel Aviv Museum and reads aloud a declaration. He proclaims the establishment of the State of Israel. The crowd behind him is weeping. 11 minutes later, The United States recognizes the new state. The Soviet Union follows. The dream of Herzl, purchased at an unimaginable cost, is real. The next day, the armies of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon cross the borders. What Israelis call the War of Independence. What Palestinians call the Nakba, the catastrophe. Both names are true. Both names are incomplete. Over the course of the war, which ends in 1949, approximately 700,000 Palestinians flee or are expelled from their homes. The number and the circumstances remain contested. In some villages, residents fled in fear, urged by Arab leaders promising return after a quick victory. In others, Jewish forces carried out deliberate expulsions. In still others, the lines of responsibility are murky, tangled in the fog and chaos of war. What is not contested is the outcome. 700,000 people. Villages emptied. Some destroyed entirely, bulldozed, replaced, erased from maps. The keys to those homes, literal iron keys, passed down through generations. A symbol of return, of connection, of a wound that has never been treated. Israel survives the war. Its territory is larger than what the UN partition had assigned. Jordan annexes the West Bank. Egypt controls Gaza. Palestinian statehood, which the UN plan had also promised, does not materialize. The Arab states that were supposed to protect Palestinian rights failed them catastrophically, and would continue to use Palestinian suffering as a political instrument for decades to come. And so the shape of the modern conflict crystallizes. Israel, newly born, surrounded by hostile neighbors, its legitimacy contested. Palestinians, newly stateless, scattered in refugee camps in Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, and in what remained of their homeland, the West Bank and Gaza, living under Jordanian and Egyptian administration, waiting. But this is only the beginning. Because 18 years later, the map changed again. Dramatically. Irrevocably. The Six-Day War. June 5 to June 10, 1967. 6 days in which the geography of the Middle East is transformed beyond recognition. Tensions had been building for months. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser closes the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping, an act Israel considers a casus belli. Arab armies mass along Israel's borders. Israeli leaders, remembering 1948, remembering the Holocaust, believing themselves on the brink of annihilation, launch a preemptive strike. In 6 days, Israel destroys the Egyptian, Jordanian, and Syrian air forces. It captures the Sinai Peninsula. It captures Gaza. It captures the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, including the Old City, including the Western Wall, the holiest site in Judaism. It captures the Golan Heights from Syria. For Israelis, it is a stunning military victory and something approaching a miracle. The Old City of Jerusalem, divided since 1948, is reunited. Jews can pray at the Western Wall for the first time in 19 years. The state that many feared would be destroyed has instead tripled in size. For Palestinians, the roughly 1 million already living in the West Bank and Gaza, now joined by a new wave of refugees, it is the beginning of military occupation. Israeli soldiers are now in charge of their daily lives. Checkpoints, curfews, military courts, the suspension of ordinary legal rights in the name of security, and the settlements begin. This is perhaps the most contested political and moral question of the entire conflict, and it continues to this day. Jewish communities, initially small and ideologically driven, later supported by government policy, begin establishing themselves in the West Bank, on land that international law, the Geneva Conventions, and the vast majority of the world's governments considers occupied territory. The settlers believe they are returning to their biblical homeland. The Palestinians see it as the slow-motion theft of what remains of their country. The Israeli government has both encouraged and permitted it, while the international community has condemned it. By 2024, there are nearly 700,000 Israeli settlers living in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. They live alongside approximately 3 million Palestinians, connected to Israel by separate roads, governed by separate laws, in an arrangement that has no agreed name and no agreed future. But this didn't start here either. And it wouldn't end here. The decades that follow 1967 are a relentless cycling of violence and negotiation, hope and collapse. In 1973, Egypt and Syria launch a surprise attack on Israel on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish year. Israel is caught off guard, sustains heavy casualties in the first days, and ultimately repels the attack, but the psychological shock is permanent. The sense that military superiority alone cannot guarantee safety. In 1982, Israel invades Lebanon to destroy the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, founded in 1964 and led by Yasser Arafat, which had conducted decades of attacks on Israeli civilians, including aircraft hijackings and the murder of Israeli athletes at the 1972 Munich Olympics. The invasion becomes a quagmire. And in the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps, Lebanese Christian militias allied with Israel carry out a massacre of Palestinian civilians. The Israeli military, which allowed the militias to enter, does not stop them. Hundreds, possibly thousands, die. An Israeli inquiry holds then Defense Minister Ariel Sharon personally responsible. In 1987, Palestinian frustration in the West Bank and Gaza. 2 decades of occupation, unemployment, humiliation at checkpoints, lack of political horizon, finally explodes in what becomes known as the First Intifada. Young Palestinians throw stones at Israeli soldiers. The soldiers respond with tear gas, rubber bullets, live ammunition. The images circulate around the world. And the Palestinian cause gains international attention that decades of PLO communiques never achieved. And then, a moment of genuine hope. Oslo, 1993. After secret negotiations in the Norwegian capital, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat stand on the White House lawn and shake hands. Rabin, a former general who spent his life fighting Palestinians, extends his hand to the man who spent his life ordering attacks on Israelis. It is one of the most extraordinary images of the 20th century. The Oslo Accords create the Palestinian Authority. They establish a framework for a 2-state solution. They are hailed as a breakthrough. And within 2 years, Yitzhak Rabin is assassinated, shot in the back at a peace rally in Tel Aviv by a young Israeli extremist who believed the prime minister was betraying the Jewish people. The peace process continues to limp forward through the 1990s, sustained by international optimism and American pressure. And then, in the summer of 2000, at Camp David, it collapses. President Clinton, Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, and Yasser Arafat cannot reach an agreement. The details of who is to blame are endlessly contested by historians and participants alike. What is not contested is the outcome. The Second Intifada begins. 5 years of suicide bombings in Israeli cafes, buses, and markets. Israeli military operations in Palestinian cities. More than 1,000 Israelis killed. More than 3,000 Palestinians killed. The walls go up, literally. Israel begins constructing a security barrier, parts concrete wall, parts fence, winding through the West Bank, cutting communities in two, and drastically reducing suicide attacks. And then the land broke in two. In the place that was supposed to be a single state. In 2006, Palestinians hold legislative elections. The international community encourages these elections as part of building democratic Palestinian institutions. Hamas, the Islamic resistance movement, founded in 1987, committed in its original charter to the destruction of Israel, wins. The United States, European Union, and Israel refuse to recognize the result. Aid is cut off. Within a year, Gaza and the West Bank have split. The Palestinian Authority, led by Mahmoud Abbas and his Fatah Party, controls the West Bank. Hamas controls Gaza. Two governments. Two competing visions. One occupied people, fractured. Hamas has murdered hundreds of Israeli civilians in suicide bombings and rocket attacks. It has also built hospitals, schools, and social services in Gaza that the Palestinian Authority failed to provide. It is both a terror organization and a government. It fills a vacuum. It generates the vacuum it fills. This is not a contradiction. It is what happens when people are left without options for long enough. Israel imposes a blockade on Gaza, citing security. Hamas's ongoing rocket attacks and weapons smuggling tunnels justify, in Israel's view, severe restrictions on what can enter the territory. Critics argue the blockade constitutes collective punishment of 2 million civilians for the actions of their government, a government many of them did not freely choose and cannot freely remove. The numbers are stark, and they tell a partial story. Gaza's unemployment rate hovers around 45%. More than half the population is under 18 years old. Children have grown up knowing almost nothing except blockade, periodic bombardment, and an enclosure that is roughly the size of Philadelphia. Since 2008, Gaza and Israel have gone to war, or what both sides call war, in 2008, 2012, 2014, 2021, and 2023. Each cycle follows a similar pattern: rocket fire from Gaza into Israel, Israeli airstrikes, escalation, international calls for ceasefire, temporary quiet, repeat. Each cycle leaves more people dead, more buildings destroyed, more trauma accumulated in a place that has run out of places to put its grief. And in Israel, the cities and towns and kibbutzim near Gaza have lived under rocket fire for nearly 2 decades. Families with 15 seconds to reach a shelter. Children with post-traumatic stress who flinch at the sound of fireworks. Communities that have tried to build normal lives within range of weapons fired deliberately at them. They are not abstractions, either. They are not acceptable collateral damage. And then came October 7, 2023. And the world changed again. Or rather, the world was forced to see what had always been there. On October 7, 2023, Hamas launches the largest and most devastating attack on Israel since the country's founding. Thousands of rockets fire toward Israeli cities simultaneously. And then, something unprecedented. Hamas fighters breach the fence around Gaza, pour into southern Israel, and attack communities that had believed themselves safe. Kibbutzim. A music festival. Family homes. 1,200 people are killed in a single day. The vast majority are civilians. Families in their homes. Young people at a concert who came to dance and were hunted. Elderly people taken from their houses. Babies. The atrocities are documented, witnessed, live-streamed in some cases by the perpetrators themselves. It is the deadliest day for Jewish people since the Holocaust. Israel's response is immediate and devastating. The government declares war. The Israeli Defense Forces begin an air campaign over Gaza, followed by a ground operation. The stated goal is the destruction of Hamas's military and governing infrastructure. But Gaza is one of the most densely populated territories on Earth. There is no military target that does not live adjacent to a civilian. There is no tunnel that does not run beneath a building where people sleep. The architecture of Hamas's military strategy, built deliberately within the civilian population, with command centers under hospitals and weapons stored in schools, means that every strike Israel makes carries a civilian cost. Within months, more than 30,000 Palestinians in Gaza are dead, according to the Gaza Ministry of Health, a number that includes both combatants and civilians, in a ratio that international humanitarian organizations describe as catastrophically high. More than 1 million people have been displaced from their homes, moving south on Israeli orders, then finding the south bombed too. The United Nations warns of famine. Hospitals run out of supplies. Children die of preventable diseases because there is no medicine to prevent them. In Israel, more than 100 hostages, seized on October 7 and taken into Gaza, remain underground in tunnel networks. Their families wait. They march. They demand. They age with their grief in ways that no policy paper can capture. The world watches, and the world argues. Protests in London and New York and Paris and Sydney. Governments divide. The question of Israel's right to defend itself becomes inseparable from the question of proportionality. The question of Palestinian suffering becomes inseparable from the question of Hamas's culpability. Every conversation becomes a battlefield of its own. And at the center of it all, ordinary people. On both sides. People who did not start this. People who did not choose this. A woman in Gaza who has moved 6 times in 6 months and has nowhere left to move. A family in a kibbutz near the border whose daughter was taken hostage and whose grandmother was killed on the same morning. A soldier who follows orders he is not sure are just. A father who sends his son to fight a war he hopes will end before his grandson has to fight it too. Human beings in a conflict that has outlasted every generation that has tried to resolve it. So where does it end? Or more honestly, does it end? Every serious attempt at peace has foundered on the same set of questions. Questions that are not merely political. They are existential. They touch the deepest layers of identity and survival and meaning. Who has sovereignty over Jerusalem, a city that both peoples regard as their capital, that 3 religions regard as sacred, that no formula has successfully divided? Where exactly does a Palestinian state begin and end, and what happens to the settlers who live on the land it would occupy? Do Palestinian refugees, and their children, and their children's children, have a right to return to the specific villages and towns they were displaced from in 1948, many of which no longer exist? And if millions of Palestinians return to what is now Israel, what happens to the Jewish majority, and therefore the Jewish state, that Herzl imagined and survivors of the Holocaust built? These are not questions with easy answers. They are questions where every answer involves someone losing something they consider fundamental to their existence. The two-state solution, 2 states, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in recognized borders, has been the framework of international diplomacy for decades. It was the basis of the Oslo Accords. It is the stated position of most of the world's governments. And yet, it has never been achieved. Each year, each new settlement built in the West Bank, each Hamas rocket, each failed negotiation, makes it harder to imagine how the physical reality on the ground could ever be reorganized into 2 viable, contiguous states. Some Israelis and Palestinians have given up on 2 states and imagine one, but they imagine different ones. Some envision a single democratic state where all citizens have equal rights, regardless of ethnicity or religion. Others envision a Jewish state from the river to the sea in which Palestinians have limited civil rights or are displaced entirely. Still others envision a Palestinian state in the same territory, with a similar outcome for Jewish Israelis. Every version of a single state requires someone to abandon the vision that has defined their people's struggle for generations. The conversation, internationally, has also calcified in ways that make honest engagement nearly impossible. To express solidarity with Palestinian suffering is, in some circles, assumed to mean denying Israel's right to exist. To express solidarity with Israeli suffering is, in other circles, assumed to mean endorsing every Israeli government policy. The actual human beings caught in the conflict, who do not have the luxury of Twitter arguments, pay the price for everyone's certainty. There is a Palestinian poet named Mahmoud Darwish who wrote, many years ago, "We have on this earth what makes life worth living." He was writing about Palestine, about the specific light in the afternoon, about the smell of bread, about the particular quality of belonging to a place that has shaped you and that you have shaped in return. There is an Israeli writer named David Grossman who has written about grief, about his son who died in the 2006 Lebanon war, about the cost of a conflict that demands, generation after generation, that families send their children to wars they hope will end but that never do. These are not opposing voices. They are the same voice, expressing the same need. The need to exist. The need to belong. The need for the land beneath your feet to be, simply, yours. The girl in the alley at the beginning of this story, the one with the backpack, the cat, the laugh that bounced off the walls. You didn't hear what happened to her. That was intentional. Because in this story, the endings are never clean. People survive and people don't. Children grow up and they don't. Buildings are destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed again. Families scatter and some never find each other. The grief accumulates in the soil the way all things eventually do. More than 100 years of this. More than 100 years since the first promises were made, the first borders drawn, the first families displaced. 4 generations have been born into this conflict on both sides. For generations who have known, as their earliest lesson about the world, that it is dangerous to belong to this particular piece of earth. And yet they stay, or they return, or they dream of returning. Because belonging is not rational. It is not a policy position. It is the weight of the soil on your grandfather's grave. It is the specific quality of the light in November. It is the language you dream in. What peace would look like, real peace, not just the absence of active bombardment, is something no one has been able to construct. Not because people don't want it. Most people, on both sides, want to live ordinary lives. They want to take their children to school and drink their morning coffee and grow old without fear. The surveys consistently show majorities, on both sides, who support some form of negotiated solution. It is not the people who are the obstacle. It is the architecture. The decades of accumulated facts on the ground. The settlements and the barriers and the blockades and the rockets and the trauma and the competing sacred claims and the diaspora politics and the regional interests and the great power maneuvering. The sheer accumulated weight of history that nobody alive chose, sitting on the shoulders of everyone who is. This conflict will not be resolved in the time it takes you to watch this video. It will not be resolved by a comment section or a hashtag or an election in any country. It will be resolved, if it is ever resolved, by people on the ground, in rooms that are not public, making compromises that will satisfy no one completely and enrage many people entirely. Or it will continue. Because it has continued before, longer than anyone expected, through ceasefire after ceasefire, through negotiation after negotiation, through the slow replacing of one generation of grief with the next. The girl in the alley. The hostage in the tunnel. The soldier at the checkpoint. The family that left in 1948 and kept the key. The family that arrived in 1948 and planted a tree. None of them chose this. All of them live it. And all of them, somewhere beneath the politics and the history and the violence, want the same impossible thing. To be safe. To belong. To stay. The question is not who is right. The question is whether rightness, about the past, about ownership, about who wronged whom first, is worth more than the lives of children who will be born into this conflict tomorrow. That question has not been answered.